Halloween has always been one of those nights that make the air feel different, electric in a way. Every year I looked forward to it, the decorations, the horror movie marathons, the general atmosphere. But something about this Halloween was off, even before the night began. It started with a flyer I found a week before. My job is boring. I'm a delivery driver, mostly for random packages and groceries, so I spend a lot of time driving around neighborhoods. One afternoon, I stopped at a small convenience store for a break. As I walked back to my truck, a brightly colored flyer caught my eye, pinned to a wooden pole outside the store. It was for a secret Halloween party. The flyer had a peculiar, old-fashioned design. The text was written in Gothic font, with skulls and cobwebs adorning the edges. What struck me as odd was the complete lack of any contact information. No phone number, no social media links, just an address, a date, and a time. 10 p.m. on Halloween night. It was intriguing, no doubt. The address wasn't far from where I lived, and my curiosity got the better of me. I saved the address on my phone and tossed the flyer in my truck. I figured if nothing else, it could be a fun way to spend the night after handing out candy to the neighborhood kids. When Halloween arrived, everything felt a little off from the start. The town was unusually quiet. Normally there'd be a buzz in the air, kids running around, decorations all over the place. But that night, the streets were eerily empty, and even the usual Halloween decorations seemed muted, almost like everyone had put in half the effort. I chalked it up to bad weather. The wind was howling, and dark clouds were swirling, threatening rain. I spent the evening handing out candy to the handful of kids that came by, but by 8:30, there were no more knocks on the door. I was left sitting on my couch, staring at the clock, debating whether or not to go to this mysterious Halloween party. 10 p.m. was creeping closer, and the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. Still, the curiosity lingered. At around 9:45, I grabbed my jacket, put on some boots, and decided to check it out. What was the worst that could happen? I thought, it's just a Halloween party. The address led me to a part of town I wasn't familiar with. It was a rural area, on the outskirts where the houses were far apart, separated by large patches of woods. The road leading there was narrow and barely lit, the trees casting long shadows that seemed to shift as my headlights passed. As I got closer, I started to doubt the address. The house numbers were fading, and the GPS was lagging, taking me further into what felt like the middle of nowhere. Finally, I reached the address listed on the flyer. The house was old. It looked abandoned, like something out of a haunted attraction. The windows were dark, the wooden siding was peeling, and there were no cars parked outside. No sign of life at all, let alone a party. I parked my truck on the gravel driveway and hesitated. The place gave me the creeps, but I had come all this way, and I figured maybe I was early, or maybe the party was inside, and I just couldn't see any decorations from the street. I stepped out of my truck and made my way to the front door. The wind whipped around me, sending chills down my spine. The only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath my boots. I knocked on the door, expecting no answer. To my surprise, the door creaked open almost immediately. There was no one standing there. I called out, "Hello," but there was no response, just silence. I should have left. Every instinct told me to get back in my truck and drive home, but something compelled me to step inside. The interior of the house was just as eerie as the outside. The wooden floorboards creaked under my weight, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. Old furniture was draped in sheets, and the only light came from a few dim, flickering candles placed haphazardly around the room. Still no signs of a party. I wandered further into the house, calling out again, "Hello? Is anyone here?" As I moved deeper into the house, I began to hear something. Faint, but unmistakable. Laughter, children's laughter. It sent a chill down my spine, and I followed the sound, hoping to find someone, anyone, to explain what was going on. The sound led me to a door at the end of a long hallway. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. I slowly turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was small and dimly lit by a single candle on a dusty table. In the center of the room, there were several old-fashioned toys scattered across the floor. A jack-in-the-box, a ragged doll, a wooden horse. But what made my blood run cold was the figure sitting in the corner of the room. It was a mannequin, dressed in an old, tattered clown costume. Its face was pale and cracked, with hollow black eyes staring directly at me. The laughter grew louder, echoing through the room, but the mannequin didn't move. It just sat there lifeless, yet somehow aware. I backed out of the room, my heart racing, and stumbled back into the hallway. The laughter followed me, growing louder and more distorted. I turned and ran, the floorboards creaking beneath me, the house seeming to close in around me. I made it back to the front door and yanked it open, only to be met with a figure standing on the porch. It was tall, dressed in a long black coat with a wide-brimmed hat that obscured its face. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure slowly raised its head, and beneath the hat I saw a face, pale, almost skeletal, with hollow, empty eyes. It grinned at me, a twisted, unnatural smile that sent a wave of terror through my body. Without thinking, I shoved past the figure and bolted to my truck. I could hear footsteps behind me, growing closer with each step. I jumped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and peeled out of the driveway as fast as I could. I didn't stop driving until I was back in the safety of my driveway, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. For days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that twisted grin, those hollow eyes staring back at me. A few days after Halloween, I tried to find the house again. I wanted to make sure it was real, that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. But when I drove back to the address, the house was gone. The driveway was overgrown with weeds, and there was no sign of the old, dilapidated house I had visited that night. It was as if it had never existed. I never told anyone about what happened that Halloween night. I didn't want to sound crazy. But every year as Halloween approaches, I get that same feeling, that sense of dread, of something watching, waiting. I've since moved out of that town, but every Halloween, I still get a flyer. It's always the same, old-fashioned design, Gothic font, no contact information, just an address, a date, and a time. I've never gone back, but I can't help but wonder, what would have happened if I hadn't left? Halloween was always a night I looked forward to. Ever since I was a kid, something was magical about it. The chill in the air, the excitement of costumes, and the joy of overflowing candy buckets. But this year was different. Not just because I'd moved into a new house, but something unsettling was lurking beneath the usual fun. I had recently relocated to a small, isolated town on the outskirts of the city. It was the kind of place where people kept to themselves, and the nights were eerily quiet. My house was on the edge of a long, dark street, far enough from the hustle of town that even Halloween didn't feel as vibrant here. The few neighbors I had were distant, rarely ever making small talk. But I was still excited to decorate the house for Halloween and get into the spirit. I spent the day setting up cobwebs, carving a jack-o'-lantern, and hanging plastic skeletons from the porch. When the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a deep purple, my house was ready for the night. I'd stocked up on candy, expecting at least a few groups of trick-or-treaters. As dusk gave way to darkness, the first kids started to appear. It was the usual mix, princesses, superheroes, and monsters, laughing and running from house to house, their faces glowing under the streetlights. I handed out candy, smiled at their costumes, and enjoyed the crisp October air. Everything seemed perfectly normal, until I noticed a small group of kids standing at the end of the street. At first glance, they didn't seem out of place, but something about them caught my attention. They weren't wearing costumes like the others. They were just standing there, not moving, not saying anything, just watching. There were 5 of them, all about the same height, maybe around 10 years old. They stood in a straight line, their heads slightly tilted down, and their faces obscured by the shadows. I squinted, trying to make out any details, but they remained still, blending into the dark. I waited for them to approach my house, to come trick-or-treating like the rest of the kids. But they didn't. They just stood there at the edge of the street staring, or at least that's what it felt like. I shrugged it off at first, thinking maybe they were waiting for friends or deciding which house to go to next. But as the night went on, I kept noticing them. No matter how many times I looked down the street, they were still there, unmoving. It was unsettling, but I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just a group of kids trying to be creepy for Halloween. But then, around 9 p.m., the other trick-or-treaters started to thin out. The usual sounds of laughter and chatter faded, and the street grew eerily quiet. I decided to pack it in for the night, figuring the rush was over. Just as I was about to turn off the porch light, I glanced down the street one more time. The group of kids was gone. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding and turned to go inside. But before I could close the door, a knock echoed through the quiet night. A slow, deliberate knock. I froze for a second, then slowly opened the door, expecting to see the group of kids finally approaching for candy. But instead, there was just one. A single child, standing on my porch, their face hidden beneath a dark hoodie. They didn't say trick or treat, or even ask for candy. They just stood there, silent. "Hey there," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "You want some candy?" No response. I leaned down slightly, trying to get a look at their face, but the hood cast a shadow that swallowed their features. The air felt colder suddenly, and I found myself gripping the door tightly. "Where are your friends?" I asked, my voice more uneasy now. Still no answer, just silence. I reached into the candy bowl, grabbed a handful of chocolates, and held it out. "Here you go," I said, hoping this would snap them out of their weird behavior. But they didn't move. Something about the stillness, the quiet, the way the child just stood there without speaking or moving, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I took a step back, still holding the candy, when suddenly the porch light flickered. It was just a brief flicker, but at that moment, the child was gone. Just like they had vanished into thin air. I blinked, my heart racing, as I stepped out onto the porch and looked around. There was no sign of anyone. The street was empty, the night was quiet, and the cold air bit at my skin. I hurried back inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. I stood there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, when I heard another knock. This time it came from the back door. I didn't have a back porch, just a small fenced-in yard. My pulse quickened, and I grabbed my phone, ready to call someone, anyone, but then the knocking came again. Louder this time, more insistent. I moved toward the back of the house, every step feeling heavier than the last. I didn't want to open the door, but I had to. I had to know what was out there. With trembling hands, I unlocked the door and swung it open. There was nothing, just the empty yard, the trees swaying in the wind, and the cold night. But then I noticed something strange. On the ground, just beyond the door, was a small, crumpled piece of paper. I bent down, picking it up. It was an old candy wrapper, one of the ones I had been handing out earlier, but scrawled across it in jagged, uneven handwriting were 3 words: "We are coming." I stumbled back, dropped the wrapper, and slammed the door shut. My mind raced with thoughts. Was this a prank? Some kind of twisted Halloween joke? But then the knocking started again. This time it came from every door, every window, all around the house. A chorus of knocks grew louder and more frantic with each passing second. I ran to the front of the house, looked out the window, and there they were. The group of kids standing in the street, staring at my house. Only this time they were closer. Much closer. I grabbed my phone and called the police, my voice shaking as I explained what was happening. They told me to stay inside and that they were sending someone over, but I didn't feel safe. The knocking continued, relentless, as if the walls themselves were pounding with fear. When the police finally arrived, the knocking stopped. The kids were gone again, and there was no sign of them anywhere. The officers looked around and checked the yard, but found nothing. No footprints, no candy wrappers, nothing. They told me it was probably just some local kids playing a prank, but I knew better. I could feel it. Something was out there, watching, waiting. I never saw those kids again after that night, but every Halloween since, I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, waiting for me to let my guard down. And I can't help but wonder, what would have happened if I had let them in? It was late October, and Halloween was approaching fast. The excitement in my small town was palpable. Decorations, parties, and of course the annual haunted hayrides. But for me, Halloween wasn't just a fun holiday. There was a darkness attached to it, a memory that always crept into my thoughts this time of year, one that I had tried hard to bury. It all began when I was a teenager, back when we were still allowed to roam around after dark without the overbearing restrictions that parents enforce now. My best friend Alex had a fascination with the macabre. He loved horror films, ghost stories, and the idea of being scared out of his wits. I didn't share his enthusiasm, but I was always up for adventure. One year when we were about 17, Alex came to me with an idea. "There's this old legend about an abandoned house just outside of town," he said. "They say it's cursed. People who go in there don't come back the same." "Cursed," I laughed. "You've been watching too many horror movies, man." "I'm serious. My brother's friend went there last year, and he refuses to talk about what happened. Some people think it's all fake, but no one knows. I say we go check it out. It's Halloween. What's the worst that could happen?" That last question felt ominous, but at the time, I shrugged it off. It was just another one of Alex's harebrained ideas, and I figured it would be fun to get a little spooked. What I didn't realize was that this would be a night I would never forget, no matter how hard I tried. Cursed, I laughed. You've been watching too many horror movies, man. You ready for this? Alex asked, grinning like a kid on Christmas morning. I nodded, feeling a little less confident than I had earlier. Something about the evening didn't feel right, but I pushed the thought away, telling myself it was just nerves. We set off towards the house, riding our bikes until we reached the edge of the woods. From there, we had to walk the rest of the way. The path was overgrown, as if nature itself was trying to swallow the house whole. The trees loomed overhead, casting long shadows in the fading light. By the time we reached the house, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and a blanket of darkness had settled over everything. The Marston house was even more imposing in person. It was tall, with shattered windows and a sagging roof. The front door was hanging off its hinges, and the yard was overgrown with weeds and dead grass. The whole place looked like it had been forgotten by time. Looks pretty creepy, huh? Alex said, his voice barely a whisper. I nodded again, my stomach churning with unease. We stood there for a moment, just staring at the house. There was no wind, no sound of animals, no rustling of leaves, just silence. It was as if the whole world had gone still. Let's go inside, Alex said, breaking the silence. I wanted to protest, but I didn't want to be the one to back out. So I followed him up the creaky steps to the front door. The wood groaned under our weight, and with every step, I felt more and more like we were walking into a trap. We stepped inside, and the air was heavy with the smell of dampness and rot. The floorboards creaked beneath our feet, and the walls were covered in peeling wallpaper. The house was empty, save for some broken furniture and debris scattered across the floor. This place is a dump, I muttered, trying to make light of the situation. Yeah, but it's a cool dump, Alex said, flashing me a grin. We wandered through the first floor, peeking into each room. There wasn't much to see, just more decay and abandonment. But as we made our way towards the back of the house, I started to feel watched. It was an unsettling sensation, like someone or something was lurking just out of sight. Do you feel that? I asked Alex, stopping in my tracks. Feel what? Like we're not alone. Alex chuckled, but there was an edge to his voice. Dude, it's just your imagination. This place is creepy, but it's empty. No one's been here in years. I wasn't convinced, but I didn't argue. We continued through the house, eventually finding ourselves at the base of a staircase that led to the second floor. The stairs were narrow and steep, and they looked like they hadn't been used in a long time. You want to go up? Alex asked. I shook my head. Nah, I'm good down here. Alex sighed. Come on, man. We didn't come all this way just to stay on the first floor. Before I could stop him, he started up the stairs. I stood at the bottom, feeling torn between following him and leaving. Something about the second floor felt wrong, but Alex wasn't going to wait for me, so I reluctantly followed him. The second floor was even more decrepit than the first. The walls were cracked and the ceiling sagged in places, but what caught my attention was a single door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, and from where I stood I could see a faint light coming from inside. Do you see that? I asked, pointing to the door. Alex nodded. Yeah, let's check it out. We approached the door slowly, and as we got closer, the light flickered, as if it were coming from a candle or a lantern. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Alex pushed the door open, and we both froze. Inside the room was a small table, and on that table sat an old-fashioned oil lamp, its flame flickering weakly. But that wasn't what terrified me. Standing in the corner of the room was a figure, tall, gaunt, and completely still. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was dressed in old, tattered clothes, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to bore into me, and his mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. For a moment, I thought it was just a mannequin, some kind of sick joke left by someone who had been here before us. But then it moved. Its head turned slowly, almost mechanically, and those hollow eyes locked onto mine. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I was paralyzed by fear. Alex grabbed my arm and yanked me out of the room. We ran down the hallway, tripping over ourselves as we bolted down the stairs. The whole house seemed to come alive around us, the walls groaning and the floorboards creaking as if the house itself was trying to keep us inside. We didn't stop running until we were outside, gasping for breath in the cold night air. I turned back to the house, half expecting to see the figure standing in the doorway, but there was nothing. Just the dark, empty house looming in the shadows. We need to go, I said, my voice shaking. Alex didn't argue. We jumped on our bikes and pedaled as fast as we could, not stopping until we were back in town. We didn't talk about what we had seen, We didn't need to. We both knew that whatever was in that house wasn't human, and it wasn't something we wanted to mess with. For weeks, I had nightmares about that figure. I could still see its hollow eyes and twisted smile every time I closed my eyes. Eventually, the nightmares faded, but the memory never did. Every Halloween, since I can't help but think about that night, about the Marston house and the things we saw inside. Alex and I never spoke of it again, and we never went back. Some things are better left alone. But every year, as Halloween approaches, I can't shake the feeling that the figure is still out there, watching, waiting, and I wonder if someday it will come looking for me.